Welcome back, fellow listener, and welcome back to my channel, my Twitch channel or YouTube channel if you watch my videos after I do the live. Also today we read Quag, the first novel of Dungeons and Dragons, and we are at chapter 13. So, in the last part, the sixth, our company of 7 heroes, the swordsman Milo Yegon, the sword maiden Yiveli, the war-boar berserker Iron Fangtooth with his pseudo-dragon companion Afrita, the cleric Divdine, the bard Wymark, and the elf rogue Ingrid and the lizardman Gult travel to finally meet the golden dragon leashes and discover land at the side of the known territory of Oerth, the world of Greyhawk. They travel to the City of Dust and begin the journey across it. Gult, the lizardman, almost died for the hot and the temperature and the scarcity of water. They save him and they found a buried vessel, an ancient dust vessel used in the past by an ancient and mysterious race. After found it, they begin to uncover it, and they are attacked by some unknown enemies. Today we discover what kind of enemy it is. It is, well, never mind. Chapter 13, The Leech Ship. A sip of water and we begin. The dust itself churned and moved, upsetting Milo as a wave might sweep the feet from under a man. He heard cries through the murk, fought to keep his feet, instinctively threw tip his shield arm to give him a small breathing space between the billow of rising grit and his body which the dust threatened to bury. Well, never mind. Already the swordsman was held tight deep in the outward spreading flood of grey-brown powder. More than half blinded, gasping for breath, Milo reeled and fought against the powder that entrapped him. For all he could tell, he was alone. The other might have been swallowed up, buried by this eruption. Yet, he could still hear faintly that infernal grunting, even what might be the clash of steel against steel. Firm in the shifting clouds of dust was a dark mass. There was a great upheaval. Where the ship lay, the craft might itself now be answering to some spell once laid upon it. Milo, his eyes smarting and watering, to rid themselves of the fine grit, moved toward it, only to be brought up, and the waves of dust sent surging by the rise of this barrier were subsiding, the air clearing. Now the sound of battle came far more strong. Milo slung his shield to his back, forced the blade of his sword between his teeth and his dust-coated mouth, and swept his hands along the wall for some method of climbing. To the left his gropings caught the dangling skeleton of a ladder. With a mighty effort, he pulled himself toward that, wondering if the stiff rope of its sides, the wood of its dolls, might crumble under his weight. He knew that, strange and unnatural as it might be, and surely born of some form of unnatural magic, this was no wall that had risen so summarily from the depths of the dust sea. Rather, it must be the long-buried ship. He gripped the ladder and fought to raise himself out of the dust, kicking it to loosen its hold on him, drawing himself up with all the strength he could muster in his straining arms. The sea sucked at him heavily, but he went on to the next handhold and the next. His feet came free, found purchase on the ladder, so he pulled himself aloft, haunted by a horror of falling back into the dry sea, there to perhaps lie entombed forever. Somehow Milo wandered to the deck, out into air that he could breathe, where the mist of dust had fallen away. Waymark stood with his back against the butt of one of the masts. The bar's harp lay at his feet, while in his hand his sword made swift play, as controlled as fingers had been on the strings of his instrument, keeping at bay 3 attackers. Nail, in were form, plowed fearlessly into others emerging from the hatch he had brushed, his heavy boar's head flashing with a speed seemingly unnatural to musty smell of corruption that wafted toward them from that crew to know that these were leeches, the undead. Their body armor was the same color as the dust that had been their outward tomb for so long. They even wore masks of metal, having but holes for eyes and nostrils, which hung from their helmets, covering their faces. The masks had been wrought in the form of fierce skulls, and tufts of metal, spun as fine as hairs, bearded their chins to fan outward over their mail corselets. They poured up from the hold surface of the deck, so Niall bore savage one of the undead with his tusk, breaking armor as brittle as the shell of a long-dead beetle, in fact breaking the leash almost in two. But its feet continued to stand, and the torso, as it fell, still aimed a blow at its attacker. Al-Alvar! Without being aware that he had given voice to the battle cry of his youth, Milo charged at the leashes that ringed Waymark at the mast. His shield slammed into the back of one, both armor and the dried body beneath broke. The swordsman stamped hard on an arm rising from the planking to sweep at his legs with one of the curved swords, brought down his own weapon on an angle between head and shoulder of another of the enemy advancing on Waymark's left, while 2 of his fellows kept the bard busy. Still clung against the breastplate edge, sheared the spread of metal thread bared, then took the helmet head from the thing's narrow shoulders. Yet Milo must strike again and again before. With a blow from his shield, he could send the dried body blundering out of his path. Dimly he heard shouts from the others, though Waymark held his breath to conserve energy for the fight. Milo leaped forward to engage a second of the undead, coming up behind the mast, its curved sword held at an angle well calculated to hamstring the bard. This leash was half crouched, and the swordsman slammed his shield with all his power against its bowed shoulders. tripping over the severed arm of one of those Weimar had earlier accounted for, an arm that still heaved with the horrible undead power. He fell, bearing under him the Lich. In this book, apparently, Lich are skeletal warriors, I think, while in Dungeons & Dragons now, Lich are powerful undead wizard. A side note, she wrote Lichy with a he at the end. So not Lich, but Lichy. He was hardly aware of a curved sword striking the planking only inches away from his head. Milo rolled away from the Lichy. Without waiting to rise farther than his knees, he used his shield as a battering weapon for a second, striking the thing's head and shoulders. Then, looking around, he saw one that had been striving to free its weapon from the nearly fossilized wood, lose both arm and half the shoulder from a blow aimed by Evil E. Her sword, used two-handed, and brought down with all the force she could deliver. Ingrid, his green-brown forest garb standing out here as a bright color, waded into the melee beyond. No arrow, not even one poisoned by the sacred potions of the western hunters, could bring death to those already dead. So the elf had dropped his bow and was using his sword. Above all other sound arose ever the terrible battle cry of Nail, who charged again and again, blood dripping now from his thickly bristled shoulders, shreds of dried skin, bits of time-eaten metal and brittle bone falling from his tusk as he stamped and gored. Something coaxed at Maya's heel, a head, or the travesty of a head sheared from a body. Freed of the grotesque mask, lips long since completely dried away, it snapped at its teeth in open menace. The swordsman kicked out, sickened. Under the force of his blow, that disembodied head spun around was gone. Milo's shield was already up to meet another rush from the two that had been the last to climb into the air. The warrior turned in a circle, striving to free himself from the weight of one of the undead. Striving. The thing had either lost or discarded its concealing helm. Its jaws were set in a hill's hind leg, and there it gnawed with mindless ferocity at the tough flesh. Then, down through the hair swept a sword serrated with wicked points of quartz, smashing the bodiless head into shattered ruin. Guilt staggered on a step or two. Nael, with a last furious shake of his leg, wheeled away from the lizardman to hunt fresh prey. He charged again and again, not at new attackers now, but stamping and lowering his great head to catch and toss aloft fragments of the undead. Though there was still movement among the fallen, arms that strove to rise aloft swords, mouths that snapped, legs fighting to rise only to continually fall back again. None of those that had been imprisoned in the ship's stood wall or ready to move against the adventurers. Weimar's arm hung limply against his side, blood dribbling sluggishly from a ripped mail near his shoulder. Ingrid knelt well away from the mass. Nael still stamped, using the blade of his sword to force apart jaws that had closed upon his ankle, with better luck than those that had earlier threatened Milo. Guilt leaned against the second mast. His knotted head was sunk upon his breast, and he kept on his feet only by his hold on the mast and the fact that his sword, pointed down on the deck, gave him support. The warrior, having reduced to shreds and shards all the fallen, shimmered. Nael Fangtooth stood there in human form, breathing hard, some of the best red glare still in his eyes, wincing as he moved from a wound on his flank. He drew a couple of deep breaths, but it was Weimark, nursing his slashed arm against him, who spoke first. There are never guardians without that which they must guard. What is it, I wonder, that these were set here to protect? Evelie had withdrawn to the edge of the deck, wiping her sword blade over and over with a corner of her cloak, then deliberately cutting off the portion of the cloth that had touched the steel and discarding it among the mass of broken bodies and armor. They were near the end of the spell that bound them so, she said, not looking at what lay there. Else they would have given us a far greater battle. Or perhaps, Milo looked to the bracelet. We have indeed learned a little of what Istaspes told us could be done. Did you also will the aid of fortune in this? There was a murmur from the rest mutual agreement. It will seem that they had perhaps changed in a little by their concentrated wills the role of those dice which marked their ability to continue to exist. Up from the open hatch spiraled Afrita. She wheeled around Nail, uttering small cries into which imagination might read some measure of distress as she hovered on the level of his leg wound. The berserker gave a gruff sound which might almost have been a log. Almost. Now then, my lady, I have taken worse. Yes, many times over. Also, his log grew. Do we not have a healer of wounds with us? He waved a hand to the bulwarks of the raised ship, where Divdine once more cradled his beds, the cleric's lips moving with an inaudible, but nonetheless meant to be potent prayer. However, what have we uncovered here beside the spell of some wizard? As the bard has said, guardians do not guard without good reason. Limping, the berserker made his way to the edge of the hatch that had been pushed back to allow the exit of the Lyci defenders. Milo glanced at Divdine, the one among them best trained to pick up any emanation of chaos, or perhaps of some other evil even older than man now living could guess. But the cleric's eyes were fast closed. He must be concentrating upon his own petitions. The swordsman went after the berserker. Even Evelie had picked a way to that opening, avoiding the noisome litter on the deck. The faint stench of corruption was stronger here. Ingrig snapped his firestone and cocked up a bit of ancient rug to bind about an arrow shaft. He did not use his bow, but rather sent the small flame down as a hand-thrown dart. It stuck into a chest, burning brightly enough to let them see that nothing now moved there. What they looked into was a well, over which reached fore and aft a walkway. On either side of it were wedged great stoppered jars, plus a few chests, piled one upon the other. Afrita fluttered down to perch on the sealed lid of one of those man-tall jars, pecking away at it between intervals of hissing. For the third time, Nail looked. She has found us what we asked of her. Down there lies something drinkable. Milo could hardly believe that countless centuries might have left any water unevaporated. He swung over and down, making his way cautiously toward the jar Afrita indicated, alert to any sound from out of the dark, which might signal that all the leeches had not yet come forth to fight. Reluctantly, he sheathed his sword, used his dagger to pick at the black sealing stuff on the jar, which was near iron heart. At last, using the blade as a chisel and the pommel of his sword as a hammer, he broke loose a first small chunk. Once that was free, the rest flicked into a dust Milo could brush away. He levered up the lid. "What have we, then?" Nail demanded as the swordsman leaned over to sniff at the contents. "Wine of the gods." The smell was faint, but the jar was full to within 2 fingers' breadth of the top. Milo wiped a finger on his breeches and lowered it. Wet and thin, not like something that had begun to solidify. He drew forth his finger, holding it close to his nose. The skin was pink, as if flushed by blood, but the smell that came to his nostril was not unpleasant. "Not water, but liquid," he reported to those above. Afrita clung to the lip of the jar and sent her spade-tipped tongue within, to lick and lick again at its contents. An object dangled down to swing within Milo's reach. He recognized one of the smaller bottles that had been fastened to their saddles. "Give me a sample!" Nail boomed from above. Obediently, the swordsman wiped off the outer skin of the bottle, pushed it deep enough into the container so that a wave of liquid was sent gurgling into the bottle. Then he allowed it to swing aloft. Prying loose the burning arrow, he trod carefully along the runway of the hold. There were at least 50 of the great jars, all sealed and wedged upright, as if their one-time owners were determined they would not leave their racks before the ship came to harbor once more. The chests were less well protected against the ravages of time. He threw open two to expose masses of ill-smelling stuff that might have either been food or material now near rotted into slime. Of the leeches, or where they had been during their imprisonment, here he could see no sign. He had no wish to move far from the promise of escape the open hatch gave. When Milo swung up via a helping rope of 2 cates twisted together, he found Divdine with his healing potions. Wymark's arm was already bound, and the bard held his hand out before him, flexing his fingers one after the other to test their suppleness. Ingrid and Evely, portions of material wrapped about their noses and mouths, were using the sweep of their swords and Evely's shield to push from the deck over into the dust the remains of the spectre forts. Gyult squatted by the foremast. His quartz-studded weapon lay across his knees, and he had bowed his head on his folded arms, as if he had withdrawn into some inner misery. Nail lay on the deck, his hair tight exposed. Into his wound, Divdine was dribbling some of the liquid from the newly opened jar below. "Ah, swordsman!" Nail hailed Milo. "It will seem this dead man had something to fight for, after all." He took the flask from the cleric's hand and allowed a goodly portion to pour from its spout into his mouth. Divdine gave one of his narrow, grudging smiles. "If I be not mistaken, today we have found a treasure here. This is the fabled wine of Pardos, that which heals the body, sharpens the wits, was the delight of the emperors of Castro in the days before the southern mountains breathed forth the plague of fire. But now Divdine's smile faded. We have troubled something that may have been a balance in this land, and who knows what will come of that." Nail took another larger swallow. "Who cares, priest? I have drunk of the vintages of the great kingdom, and twice plundered the caravans of the Painim, who fancy themselves the greatest vintners of our age. Now they could offer goes so smoothly down, and man's throat. At man's throat, fuels such a gentle warmth in his belly, or makes him look about him with a brighter eye. Wine of Pardos or not?" He set down the flask and slapped his hand against his chest. "By the brazen voice of Gangklang, I am whole and a proper man again." Since deep down had pronounced the bounty from below good, they drew upon it freely, filling the skins that had shrunken to empty flaps. Guilt offered no refusal when the cleric washed down once more the little man's dust-clogged skin and soaked his cloak in another of the jars, leaving it there to become completely saturated. They made their camp on board the ship and speculated as to what had brought it boiling out of the dust and set its dead defenders upon them. Perhaps here, too, a gas had been set on the ship, and defenders which their disturbance of its burial had brought so to fulfillment. Though the elf and the cleric had used their talents to sniff out any form of the greater magic that might lie on board, both admitted that they were left with that mystery unresolved. Milo privately believed that the army of the Lyci had not been set for what might be a millennium, merely to guard a cargo of wine jars, precious though those might be. He could not deny that the wine did have powers of recuperation. Wounds bathed in it closed nearly instantly, while it was as refreshing to the taste as the clearest and coldest of spring water could have been. As he took the second part of the night watch, he moved slowly back and forth along the deck, wishing they might use this ship to travel onward. But the masts were bare of any sail, and neither he nor the others, though they had discussed the matter wistfully, could see any other form of propulsion. They had not tried to explore the ship farther than the hatch Niall had originally forced open. At the stern there was the bulk of a cabin, the door of which had resisted even Niall's strength when he had earlier tried it. Milo believed that the berserker was now willing to leave well enough alone. The battle with the Lycis, a victory though it had been, had left them all shaken. It was one thing to face the living, another to have to batter to pieces things already dead, but endowed with the horrible strength and will these had displayed. Milo made his way to the bow of the ship. As always in the sea of dust, here came a soft whispering from the dunes. Now it seemed to him that he heard more than just the wind, the shift of the dust, that the whispering was real. He strained to catch actual words uttered in a voice below, just below the level of his hearing. So vivid was the impression that out there enemy forces were gathering that he glanced now and then to his bracelet, expecting to see it come to life in warning. Milo made his sentry rounds, up one side of the deck, down the other, passing the cloak-wrapped forms of the others with an ever-growing urgency. He even went to hang over the side railing and stared down to where the debris of the battle had been flung. But there was nothing of it to be seen. Shattered bone, rust-breached armor, all had vanished into the dust, as if those they had fought had never existed at all. However, there was something abroad in the night. The swordsman set a firm rein upon his imagination. There was nothing abroad in the night. He was well aware that his senses were far inferior to those of either Ingrig or Niall, that Afrita perhaps had the keenest ability of them all. Surely the wine they had drunk had not brought any dimming of mind with it, only a renewal of strength. Then why did he seek what was neither to be seen nor heard? Still, he tramped the deck and watched and waited for what he could not have said. Ridden by increasing uneasiness, he went to awaken Niall to take the next watch. Yet the swordsman hesitated to speak of his unrest, knowing full well that the berserker would be far more able to detect anything that was wrong. Milo could not remember having dreamed so vividly before as he did now in the sleep into which he swiftly slid. The dream had the same background as when he had been on watch. Possessing such a reality, he might have been fastened by some spell to the mast, immobile and speechless to watch what happened. Nail, limping very little, was making the same round Milo himself had followed during his tour as sentry. When the berserker reached the bow of the ship the second time, he stood still, a certain tenseness in his stance, his head turned to stare southward over the billows of the dust sea. Then Milo, in the dream, followed Nail's fixed gaze. It was like those shadows that had dodged them across the plains, and yet not the same either. He believed that he did not really see, he only caught through Nail's mind, in some odd, indescribable way, the sensation of seeing, as if one were trying to describe to the blind the sense of sight itself. But there was that out there which Nail did not see and which held the berserker's attention locked fast. Nail hitched his cloak about him, axe firmly grasped in his hand. He returned to where the ladder hung. Down he climbed, over the rail and into the dust. As he saw passed out of Milo's sight, the swordsman fought against the bonds of the dream, for he was now certain, without being told, that Nail Fangtooth was being drawn away, led by what he saw. Milo's struggles to awaken did not break the dream. He was forced to watch Nail, dust shoes once more bound to his feet, slip and slide away from the ship, his broad back turned on his companions, as if they had been wiped from his memory. There was an eagerness in Nail's going. It was almost as if he saw before him someone or something he had long sought. In spite of the unsteady surface beneath his feet, he plugged steadily southward, while Milo was forced to watch him vanish, wearing a path among the whispering dunes. When Nail was swallowed up by the dust sea, Milo himself dropped into darkness in which there was nothing more to be seen or puzzled over. "Milo!" A voice roared through the darkness, broke open his cocoon of not caring. He opened his eyes. On one side knelt Wymark, the louder lines about his generous mouth, bracketing his eyes, wiped from his sun-tanned skin. As Milo shifted his head at a touch upon his shoulder, he saw to his left Yveli, her helmet laid aside, so that the red-brown of her tightly netted hair was fully visible. In her thin face, her eyes narrowed in a strange weariness, measuring him. "What?" he began. Where is Nail?" The question drew Milo's attention back to the bard. The swordsman levered himself up on his elbows. Out of the smothering and deadening dark from which they had drawn him came, in a burst of vivid memory, that strange dream. Before he thought of what might be only vision, he spoke aloud. "He went south," and at the same moment he knew that he indeed spoke the truth. Sorry? So much... sorry, wait a second, I have problem with the... Okay. End of chapter 13. End of chapter 13. Okay, next chapter, chapter 14, we make a little break, an intermission. I received some text from work, from my job I have to read. After that, we return and we read chapter 14. A second. My cat is making some noise. Almost there, almost there. Okay. Okay, let's return to our book, and we have the last chapter of today, chapter 14, Rokna the Brazen. A sip of water before start. Always a sip of water before start. Good practice. Nice. I stroke myself. Swiftly, Milo added to that guess, which was no guess, he was certain, but the truth. The description of his dream. Divine nodded before the swordsman had finished. Head high, the cleric had drawn a little away to the same position in the bow that Nail had first held in Milo's vision. Now he leaned forward, his attention centered as far as the berserker had been. Milo scrambled up behind him, one hand clutching at the cleric's shoulder. "What do you say?" he demanded. His own eyes could pick up nothing but the waves of dust dunes marching on and on until the half-light of early dawn melted one into another. "I say nothing." Divine did not turn his head, but there is that out there which awakes a warning. Sorcery carries its own odor, one which can be tainted even as those that befall this ship. The cleric's nostrils were distended. Now they quivered a little, as do those of a hound seeking out the trace of a quarry. Ingrid moved up to join them with the noiseless tread of his race. "Chaos works." His words were without emotion, as he, too, stared into the endless rise and fall of the dust billows. "And yet..." Divine nodded sharply. "Yes, it is, and yet, elf warrior. Evil, but of a new kind, of ferox old mingled with the new. Our comrade in arms goes to seek it, and not with his mind." "What do you mean?" Milo wanted to know. "That sorcery has laid a finger on him, and might must be the power of that finger, for the Werkin possess their own potent magic. I say that Nail Fangtooth does not govern his body in this hour, and ferox even not his mind." Divine replied slowly. The bard and Evely had drawn closer. Now Weimar slung his bagged harp over his shoulder. "That would argue that we may be needed," he said matter-of-factly. Within himself, Milo knew the truth of a decision he had not even been aware of making. Though they were not kin by either blood or choice, he had no strong liking for the Werkind, as no fighter did who had not the power of the change. Yet, at this moment, he could walk in no way that did not lead him on the trail of Nail. Tied they were one to the other by a bond stronger than choice. He glanced at the ring that had led them by its thread map patterning. A film of dust lay across the veined stone. When Milo rubbed at the setting with his other thumb, striving to clear it, he discovered the haze was no dust, but an apparent fading of the lines themselves. South and west Nail had tramped in the swordsman's vision. Afrita curled the slumber about his throat. Was it that both the berserker and the pseudo-dragon had been ensnared in a single spell? Across these dust dunes, what man could leave a trail to be followed after he himself had disappeared? The rest of them could wander here, lost, until they died from lack of water or were caught in the menace of some trap such as this ship had held. Yet, south and west they must go. They busied themselves with their packs. Guilt drew about him the cloak which had been left to soak up all that it might of the wine. Then, one by one, they dropped from the deck of the ship, their dust-walking shoes strapped on firmly, to set out in the wake of the berserker. The elf, as he had on the plain, moved to the fore of the party, walking with a steady purpose as if he guessed what they saw lay ahead. Slowly their sun rose. In this land it had a pallor and was obscured from time to time by wind-driven clouds of grit. Once more they bound those strips cut from their clothing about their mouths, shielding that part of their faces left bare below the outshot of a helm, the hood of travel cloak. Milo wondered at the sureness of the elf who led them. Sureness. In this fog of dust, he himself would have been long since lost, might perhaps wander in circles until he died. He kept close watch upon his map ring, hoping that it would flare once more into life, provide a compass. That did not happen. Luckily, those gusts of wind that carried the dust in whirring and clouds blew only intermittently. There were periods when the fog of particles was stilled. That during one such moment, Ingrid paused, raised one hand in a signal that halted the other. The plodding guilt, muffled in his now dust-covered cloak, plowed into Milo with force enough to nearly knock the swordsman from his feet. "What?" Evelyn's voice was hoarse. She had uttered but that one word when the elf made a second emphatic gesture, while Mark shifted the harp upon his shoulder. His head was upheld, but his face was so covered by the improvised mask that Milo read urgency only in the movements of his body. Whatever had alerted the elf had reached the bard also. Still Milo himself was aware of nothing. Nothing, until the sound was faint, yet he caught it. A hissing scream, such a crying came from no human throat. "Big Scarlet One!" The slowering in Gil's voice nearly matched the hiss of that scream. Togi, he stood shoulder to shoulder with Milo. The lizardman's words were muffled and hard to catch. A second and the third time that challenge sounded. For it was a challenge, and such as Milo had once heard with dread. A scrap of memory stirred awake in his mind. Big-scaled one? Dragon! In that moment, the bracelet on his wrist gave forth the warmth he both waited and feared. Feverishly, he tried to channel his power of thought, not to awaken memory, but to affect the turn of the dice. A dragon in full battle fever. What man or man could hope to stand against such? Still, with the rest, he moved toward the source of that cry, his dust shoes shuffling at the fastest pace he could maintain. Even aware with power of the change, could not hope to front a dragon and come forth unscathed, or even living. They tried to make better time by seeking out a way between the dunes, not up and down the treacherous sledding heights of those mounds. Again they heard the dragon call, which did not yet hold any note of triumph. Somehow he whom they sought, for Milo never doubted that it was Nail Fangtooth who fronted the skeleton menace, managed to keep fighting on. The hissing of the giant reptile was louder. On their wrists the dice had ceased to live and spin. How successful had they been in raising their power? To fight the dragon, Milo shook his head at his present fury. Still he plowed on, his sword now in his hand. Togi could not remember having drawn it. So they came into a space where the dust dunes had been leveled through some freak of the wind. This miniature plain formed the arena of a battle. The arena, non arena. Arena is Italian, arena is English. Similar, yeah? Arena. The dragon, its wings strangely small, as if shriveled to a size that could not raise the bloated body from the heart, beat the air, raising a mark through which its own brazen scale shone with the menace of a raging fire. This creature was smaller than Lich's, but that was no measurement to promise victory, as its head snapped aloft and it opened its fanged jaws for another of those screams. Its rolling red eyes caught sight of their party. With a speed its bulk should have made impossible, that double-homed head darted at them, striking snake-like. Milo could smell the strong acid stench of the pointed tongue which dripped with venom. A poison to fire ate the flesh from a man's bones in the space of 5 breaths, for which no surgery could supply a remedy. His battery shield had been lifted only a finger's breadth, and he had no chance, he knew, against such a lightning-swift attack. For it seemed to Milo those blazing red eyes were centered on him. Then, out in the air, there came a darting thing, small enough in size to ride upon the spear point of that dripping tongue, but it was not to ride so that the thing made a blur of attack. Rather, she spread small claws to gash and tear at the tongue, fearless of the venom gathered in dripping from the lash of yellow-red flesh. The venom. The tongue, venom. The tongue whipped and struck from side to side, curling to size a small attacker and drove into the dragon's maw the glittering body of Afrita, even as a frog of the marshes strikes and takes into its gaping mouth an unwary fly. Now the pseudo-dragon twisted and turned in the murk, sometimes hidden, now visible again. Afrita could not come at the tongue again to strike, but neither did she retreat. Her maneuvers meant that the dragon might not carry forward its attack on the party below. Out of the dust cloud, which the dragon's fanning wings kept alive, came the boar shape Milo had seen in action before. But this time Nail Fangtooth was hampered. His worship vanished, and he was a man for 3 strides, then a boar, and then a man, a constant change of shapes that it seemed the berserker could not control. The man's body held for longer and longer moments, until at last Nail gave up his struggle to go where. Instead, axe in both fists, he fronted the dragon as a man. The fitful stripes and twists of the skilled body made a blurring, cloudy battle, but it was Afrita's determined assault on the creature's head and tongue that prevailed. Though the pseudo-dragon was twice nearly caught, and looping coil snapped with fast through the air. Something else pierced the cloud of dust. Milo saw an arrow thud against the heavy brow ridge of the embattled dragon, fall to the ground. Ingrig was methodically aiming at the most vulnerable part of the creature, his slightly bulbous eyes. Only so fast were the dartings of the dragon head that it would seem even one with the fabulous skill of the ranger folk could not hope to strike such a target. The constant fanning of those wings was a distraction, and the grit they broke into the air, stung in the eyes, was like to blind those the creature fronted. It screamed and bellowed, striving to use its tongue, the forked barb on the hand of death, more deadly than any arrow human or half-kind could fashion. Milo moved in, discovering that fear and the kind of anger with the sight of that body awoke in him made him a battlefield of their own. The emotions remained equally matched. So he did not run from the encounter, as half of him wanted, but hampered forward, hampered by the dust shoes. There were other shadows in the deepening rise of the dusk the wings created. He was not alone, still he was, walled by that fear he could not yet rise enough anger to master. His sword was heavy in his hand as he caught enough sight of that pendulous skilled belly to give him a target of sorts. Milo struck with all the speed and skill he could master. Unlike the fight on the ship, nothing gave or broke under that blow. Rather, it was as if he had brought the point of his blade against immovable stone. The hilt was nearly jarred from his hold. Then, close enough so that the stench of it made his head swim for an instant, the looping tongue, with behind it that armory of regret, discolored fangs, swept toward him. There was a speeding dart through the air, perhaps more from an unusual turn of fortune than an inherent skill. The down-turned spike of that tongue was pierced through by an arrow. The shaft gravitated in a wild dance, as the dragon lashed back and forth its most cunning weapon, striving to free its tongue hand. Out of the dust cloud arose a clawed foot, each talon on it being a quarter of Milo's own body length. The foot expanded and contracted those claws, striving to catch at the arrow. In so doing, the movements exposed for an instant only a small scarlet pocket of noisome flesh existing between limb and body. The swordsman threw himself forward, nigh losing his balance because he had forgotten the dust shoes. Though Milo went to one knee, he thrust again with his sword into that crevice between limb and body. That crevice between limb and body. Crevice. I don't know the correct crevice. Then he was hurled aside, skidding face downward into the dust, where his fight changed to one for breath alone. He waited for a second slash of that foot to rip him into bloody wrecks, but the blow did not come. Desperately squirmed deeper into the dust, one arm protecting his face, hoping in some way to use the stuff that had defeated him to protect him a little now. One breath length of time, perhaps a little more, passed. Then there sounded a cry that deafened him. The sound went on, ringing through his head, until the whole world held nothing else but that bellow of fury and agony. A hand caught at his shoulder, pulled at him. Milo squirmed in the direction that clutch would draw him. Why he had not been seized already by the claws of the dragon he did not know. Each second of freedom he still had, he determined to to escape, vain though any hope of what that might be. Now a second set of fingers was on his other shoulder, and they beat as deep as his mail would allow, new strength in them drawing him on. Behind sounded another scratch, and through it the roaring of another voice, human in timbre, mouthing words Milo could not understand. When he was again on his feet, aided by those odds upon him, he saw that it was Divine and Guilt who had come to his aid. Breathless, his mouth and throat choked with dust until he was near to the point of retching, he swung around. Nail, in human form, fronted the dragon. From the right eye of the maddened beast bobbed the fettered hand of an arrow, proving that the famous skill of the half-kind was not distorted by report. The axe of the berserker moved with skill and speed to strike at the maimed head that darted down at him. Near enough to evoke attack in turn was a slender figure with shield raised as a protection against the venom-dripping tongue, sword held with the readiness and cool skill of a veteran. Steel arose and held steady. The creature had shaken free of the arrow that had pinned its tongue, but the tongue tip was now split raggedly asunder. Perhaps in its pain the dragon lost what wits it carried into combat, for the tongue flicked at the steadily held sword as if to enmesh the steel and tear it from the warrior's hand. Instead, the now rugged flesh came with force against the cutting edge of the blade. There was a shower of venom and dark blood. A length of tongue, wriggling like a serpent, flew through the dusty mark. Now jaws gaped over the warrior. The head came down. Nail struck, his axe meeting the descending head with a force that the dragon's attack must have added to. The creature gave another cry, spewing forth blood, and jerked its head aloft. So it dragged from Nail's hand the axe that was embedded in its skull between the eyes. The axe. It reared high, and Milo cried out, though his warning might be useless even as he gave it. Nail's arms wafted evilly from her feet, sending her rolling into the embrace of the dust, into which she sank as into a sea of water. Even as the berserker had sent her as well out of danger as he could, Nail himself threw his own body backward, striving to avoid the second descent of that fearsome head. So loudly did the dragon cry, Milo heard no twang of bowstring. Yet he saw a feathered shaft appear in the left eye, sink into it for most of its length. The creature crashed forward, though its stumpy wings still fluttered. The force of its fall sent it deep into the dust, just missing Nail, who fought his way through it as if he swam. Up from the embrace of the dust, they blinded the head of the dragon heaved once, curving back upon the wings, snout and evil mask of the foreface pointing the sky above them. The roar from the fanged jaws was such that Milo's hands covered his ears, endeavoring to shut out the scream of pain and freatless rage. Twice more did the creature give voice, and then its head sank, jerked up a little, sank again. The ensuing silence held them all as might a spell. Milo dropped his hands, stared at the bulk now sinking deeper into the hold of the dust. A dragon, and it was slain. He found his heart beating faster, his breath coming quicker. Fortune indeed had stood at their backs this day. Nail floundered to his feet, fought the dust to get back to the creature's side. His hands closed upon the haft of his axe, and his body tensed with effort as he strove to loosen the blade from the skull. Milo looked to Ingrid. "Never shall I doubt what is said of the arrow mastery of your people," he said through the dust which still clogged his throat. "Nor words and axe skill of yours," returned the elf. "Your own stroke, swordsman, was not one to be despised." "My stroke?" Milo glanced down at his hands. They were empty. For the first time he thought of shields and sword. If you will regain your steel," the Divine said, "you needs must borrow for it, before the skeleton one is utterly lost in the dust." He gestured to the body of the dragon, now indeed some 3/4 buried, though the wings still twitched feebly now and then, Ferras so keeping clear the scaled back that they could still see through the dispersing fog. Two forms, so clothed in dust as to seem a part of that same fog, came blundering away from where Nail still fought to free his axe. The larger brushed the clinging wreath from the smaller, the hump of a harp between his shoulders identifying the bard. At the cleric's words, he raised his head, his face so masked in dust that he might have walked by blood kin and not been hailed. "This was such a battle as can make sound fodder," he spat dust. "Yes, swordsman, that was a lucky stroke of yours beneath the leg. Even as this valiant battlemate did sever the poisoned tongue. Dragon slayers, all of you, for it took the skill of more than one to bring down Rockna of the brass." "Ah!" Nail had his axe free. Now he looked over his shoulder. "Dig it will be for your steel, swordsman." Even as Milo pushed forward, trying vainly to remember the feel of skeletal skin parting from his own blow and finding that the second or two of realization eluded him, the berserker began to dig furiously along the body of the dragon, using as they had on the ship his dust show for a scooping shovel. Milo hastened to join. The fetid smell of the creature's body was nearly overpowering as they worked shoulder to shoulder. Now Weimark and Divine came to aid them. A lost word was enough to threaten them all in this place and time. Milo coughed, spat, and kept to his scooping. Their combined efforts laid bare the shoulder of the creatures and the top of the foreleg. Niall put hand to the leg and heaved, striving to draw it aside, leaving a crevice between body and leg free from the slider of the ever-moving dust. Milo leaned far over, gagging at the stench. There indeed was his sword. He could sight the hilt protruding at an angle from the softer scaled leg. Lying across the limb of the dragon, he put both hands to the hilt, as Niall had done with the axe, and exerted his full strength. Though he could not remember planting that still so, he must have done it with energy enough to bury it deeply. At first there was solid resistance to his struggle, then the length buried within the body of Rachna gave. He sprawled back, the blood-stained blade snapping up and out into the open. "Hola!" That cry drew all their attention. Ingrid had, unseen, climbed one of the dunes that ringed this arena in which they had fought. He was looking north, and now his arm arose in a gesture Milo could not read. But Divdine started a step or so forward, then came to a halt. The dusty face he turned toward the others was grave. We go from peril to peril, he fumbled with his best again. Niall's head lifted, he growled, his rumble sounding more like the irritated grunt of a bear than either man or boar. What haunts us now, priest? Dragon? Lishi? Wymark watched the elf who was coming down the dune, setting one foot below the other with careful precision and more speed than Milo knew he himself could give to such action. The wind! The elf came up to them. There is a storm raising the dust and coming toward us. Dust! Milo's toes moved fearfully, a sea of dust, just as the desert was a sea of sand, and he had heard only too much of what happened to those caught in the wild whirl of sandstorms. This dust was finer, would be more easily swept up and carried to bury a man. Weimar swung around, looking to the dragon their efforts had partly unburied. What was our bane may be our fortune, he observed with some vigor. The storm is from the north? Ingrid gave a single swift nod. He too was looking to the dragon's body. You mean, yes, a perilous saint indeed, but perhaps our only one now. Divdine dropped his bats into the front of his robe. It is such a chance as the Ozannen take in desert lands when caught in storms. He stopped and loosed one of his dust shoes. They made his way around the half-uncovered dragon and started to dig with the same vigor that Milo and Niall had used moments earlier. That they could use the body for a barrier against clouds of whirling dust, Milo doubted. But perilous though such a chance might be, to find any better escape from what was now out of the question. So they dug with a will, heaping the dust they dredged out on the far side of the skeleton body. Suddenly Evely spoke. If that were set down, she pointed to the stuff they erased and tossed beyond. Will it not cake into a greater barrier? See, here the dragon's blood has stiffened this dust into a solid surface. We fight against dust, not sand. What we deal with is far lighter and less abrasive. It is a thought worth the following. Milo looked to where those skins filled with the ship's wine lay. If one balanced drinkers needs against such a suggestion, which would give them the best saints for survival? A good one! Weimar started for the skins. As you say, we do not face sand, for which may the abiding aid of Falfort the Sun Crown be praised. They decided that 2 of the skins might be sacrificed to their scheme. It was Divdine and the bard who, between them, dribbled the wine across the heaped dust beyond the dragon's bulk. Milo took heart at their efforts when he saw that indeed the blood that had seeped from the slain creature had puddled and hardened the fine grit into flat plates which could be lifted and used to reinforce the wine-stiffened dust. They worked feverishly, moving as fast as they could. Now one could see the dust cloud darkening the sky. Moments later, they crouched, their cloaks drawn over their heads, to provide pockets of breathable air. Air that was air, whether it be tainted with the stench of the dragon's body or not. The rogue edges of the dead beast's scales bit into their own flesh as they strove to settle themselves to endure attack from this subtle and first more dangerous foe. End of chapter 14. We are almost at the end. For chapter, I think, remains. I'm not sure. We are at 77%. Okay. I want. Okay. Yep. We are. 4 chapter remains. I'm curious of the ending. There is a lot to do. A lot more to do. They are still in the Sea of Dust. I'm curious of this unknown enemy. Anyway, this is chapter 14. Sorry. Tomorrow we will read another 2 chapter, 15 and 16. Then Monday we end our first Grey Oak book with chapter 17 and 18. So don't miss that. For today is all. Have a nice evening. Goodbye from me. Ciao. Ping.